Okay, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I welcome each one of you to our end of the semester talk, you may call it. This will be a series of Usul talks. We will invite outstanding scholars from different disciplines to give talks to our students as well as the audience from outside Usul Academy. Inshallah ta'ala, I welcome each one of you, and I give each one of you my salams and greetings. May Allah make this a meeting with full barakah. We will benefit from the experience of Dr. Hooman Keshavarzi, who has been working in this field for a long time. He has a unique stand, very different than the conventional psychological perspectives. I believe you will enjoy this talk and benefit from it. It fits very well with the perspective of Usul Academy, the comparative perspective to the existing disciplines, as well as linking the intellectual heritage to the present issues, present questions. So Dr. Hooman's work is a good example for this. He will demonstrate how you can link the traditional Islamic knowledge to a present discipline and also to the present issues. I believe we will all enjoy and benefit his talk, and I thank him for accepting our invitation to give this talk, and I also thank for everyone who contributed in the organization of this talk. And this is the first one, first Usul talk. Inshallah ta'ala, in the future we will have other great scholars, prominent academics, ulama, fuqaha, giving similar talks, reflecting how to combine traditional knowledge with the present day disciplines and how to apply the knowledge we inherit from our intellectual heritage to the present day questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Hooman. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to everyone.
Those of you who don't know, Professor Sidi Rajab Shentuk is president of Usul Academy, and Usul Academy is a new global initiative. It's a virtual madrasa online aimed at training a new generation of scholars for this ummah, inshallah, that combines the best of the classical Ottoman curriculum with a variety of different social science subjects and humanities subjects, custom designed for the specific requirements and needs of this Islamic institution, inshallah. With us today is Dr. Hooman Keshavarzi. Dr. Hooman is one of those figures whose CV you have to really pick and choose from when introducing him, mashallah. He has several degrees and a various and very rich background. Primarily, he works in the field of psychotherapy, particularly in the state of Illinois in the United States, and he held a doctorate of clinical psychology, a master's of clinical psychology, and a bachelor's of science. He's currently a visiting scholar at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul, also adjunct professor at American Islamic College, Hartford Seminary, and instructor of psychology at Islamic Online University, and the founding director of the well-known Khalil Center, the first Islamically oriented professional community mental wellness center in the United States, and one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, in the world. He's also a fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding at the Global Health Center, conducting research on a variety of issues related to social policy, Muslims, and mental health. The well-known international speaker, mashallah. He also has a solid grounding in the traditional ulum, in addition to his Western academic training. He used to be a student of, and still is a student of, Muhammad Zakaria in Toronto, the Sheikh Azimuddin Ahmed in Chicago at Dar es Salaam Academy, and Sheikh Amin Khawaldia in Islamic counseling. He's currently also pursuing higher education in Islamic knowledge at Dar al-Qasim. Without further ado, I introduce to you Professor Hooman Keshavarzi on Islamic psychology. Bismillah, Sidna. Tafaddal.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm very honored today and honored to be invited by my teacher, actually Dr. Rajab, who's with us today. His presence in the talk actually makes me a little bit nervous, but inshallah his du'as and his good opinion of me and confidence in me will inshallah put something in me to say something beneficial for everybody. So Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi wahda wa salatu wa salamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da. So we want to talk a little bit about today, looking at the Islamic intellectual heritage in order to address some of the main questions in the modern field of psychology. These are questions that have plagued psychologists for a long time, most particularly for the past 100 to 150 years. And before we jump into some of those questions, I really want to kind of build a little bit of background and foundations. Just to speak about modern psychology today. Modern psychology really starts to develop and materialize in the early 1900s. Of course, we know in the in the 1800s, late 1800s, we have psychoanalysis and Freud, but really those are some of the beginnings, and some modern psychology as it is today really starts to take shape in particularly in the US around the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, there's a very important organization that's developed that is instituted, which is still the most dominant body and professional association for psychologists across in the US, but also influences the entire field globally. And that is the American Psychological Association. Cattell instituted this in the early 1900s, and an important aspect of this institution that I think is very notable to keep in mind is that around the time that they instituted this, all of the members of the American Psychological Association had a dual membership in two different associations. The other membership that they had was called the Society for Psychical Research. This society was a society that was really focused more on metaphysics and metaphysical questions as well. And naturally, as individuals interested in psychology, it made sense that they were also interested in metaphysics. However, when they formed the American Psychological Association, they said, we really need to make a decision. We have to decide, are we going the route of metaphysics or are we going the route of the sciences? And so they made a collective decision that they would really develop and ground the American Psychological Association in the empirical sciences and the empirical method. Part of that decision was because of the American Medical Association, right, which they were sort of living under the shadow of, and the continuing and developing reputation and dominance of the hard sciences. So they made a decision to abandon their membership in the Society for Psychical Research, and they collectively revoked their memberships from the Society for Psychical Research in order to ensure that they do not taint this empirical new venture that they have started. With the exception of a very important and notable psychologist, American psychologist, William James, the father of structuralism, who is known for his structuralism, although a lot of his works on transcendental, mystical, and spiritual experiences is not as well known. He still continued to write in metaphysics. Just important to note, by the way. Now, I mentioned that because we started off in the early 1900s, and then I'd like to point something out that happens about, where we are today. I'd like to sort of build the ground for where we are today. After they've made this decision, we start to see the really development of behaviorism, right? They sort of take a very strict reductionist empirical approach, resembling the hard sciences, where they even reject all subjective self-reports as well. They reject cognition and thinking even, because they said it's something that we can't see. It's something in the black box. They go with the strict scientific method. But this comes full circle. The pendulum swings the other way. I want to show us where we are today, right, in the 20th century, or rather the 21st century. So about 100 years later, right, psychology has kind of come full circle. They've come full circle to start to re-examine and look at metaphysical experiences and to really think outside of the box for addressing psychological, these questions of psychology. And I want to read to you a portion of Susan McDaniel's 2016 speech, that she gave as the keynote address. And she was the president of the APA for this year. And she says, I quote, "These countries," meaning countries outside of Western Europe and the US, "have some of the most advanced civilizations in human history, with philosophies that do not always fit with the tenets of Western psychology. All psychology is cross-cultural. It can be challenging to avoid projecting our own values and intentions in science and practice. The commitment is clear to develop a psychology that incorporates Western science and Eastern philosophies. However, not everything is verifiable through the scientific methodology. This is a challenge because some assumptions of Western models do not fit the Eastern experience." This is really incredible kind of statement for the president of the APA to state. 106, almost a little over 100 years since the inception of the APA. The following year, in 2017, by the way, I myself and a couple of my colleagues from Khalil Center present on a panel for the first ever Psychology and Islam panel at the American Psychological Association. This is the largest gathering of psychologists in the world, and alhamdulillah, they opened the panel to these Eastern experiences the following year, and we presented. Very interestingly enough, their even more empiricist rival, right, the American Psychiatric Association, follows suit, and then in 2018, right, they invited us to do a similar panel at the American Psychiatric Association. So this kind of shows you that, we're coming full circle, and that there's an interest in what do Muslims and their rich Islamic intellectual heritage have to say, and what can they provide to enrich the field of psychology today. And this is where we come in today. And here's what I propose. This is my kind of proposal here. We're saying, look, what we want to do is to look in the Islamic scholarly tradition in order to extract knowledge related to the questions in psychology, right? Because we need to, this corpus, this heritage and inheritance that's over 1,400 years old is so rich with so much literature that needs to be mined and unearthed. And what we really like to do is to draw out some of that literature in order to be able to enrich the field of modern psychology with the contributions of our scholars of the past, inshallah. Because why? Islam is a living tradition, right? Islam is a living tradition, and Allah Ta'ala describes the Muslims as كَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. This wasatiyah becomes really, really important. And I'd like, and I'm going to touch upon this a little bit later, the capacity to be able to bridge and appropriate different bodies of knowledge, different bodies of information in a very moderate way, in a balanced way. We have a tradition that can reconcile, right, between secular and quote unquote, not secular rather, I don't like that term actually, the academic and sacred knowledge, or the contextual and worldly sciences and the sacred sciences. We have a tradition that has a capacity to be able to do this. And the term that we use for this that's coined by Dr. Rajab is multiplexity, right? A multiplex methodology that allows us to position different types of facts and information in their appropriate places, and then to synthesize this information to be able to answer and address contemporary issues and problems. So let's kind of, go through this now. Now, when we look into the Islamic, now I want to actually do a little bit of a survey. What I'm going to do today is, when you go to the grocery store, some of these large grocery stores, what you do is you get a little sample of the new products that they've produced, right? So they have like a pizza that they just came out with. So they give you a little sample of it, some new donuts, and then they have these little counter and they give you a sample, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of a sampling, right? Of course, in such a short period of time, we'll never be able to do justice to the richness of the Islamic intellectual heritage. But what we really want to do is just give a little flavor, a little sampling of the types of literature that's out there in our tradition that can make significant changes in our thinking on human psychology. Now, when we think about human psychology and the Islamic intellectual heritage, where can we find it? Because a lot of people are confused by this. They say, hey, is there a textbook on psychology that I can pick up that's been written? And then their expectation is like a Psych 101 type of book in Arabic, written in the same way as today. And the answer is no, there isn't that. That you have to appreciate and understand how the Islamic intellectual heritage works. You have to appreciate and understand how the Islamic sciences work. Therefore, without knowing where to look, a person can get lost. And so I've kind of created this little chart and map to give us some information, or to give us a kind of a broad scope as to where we can look. What is the term for Islamic psychology in the Islamic sciences? There's a couple of names for it, right? There's the term called ilm al-nafs, right? Ilm al-nafs, though, is largely works written by philosophers. It's much more philosophical, but perhaps the modern psychology, the closest proximate terms that we can find in the Islamic intellectual heritage is the notion of tib al-ruhani, tib al-ruhani, or tib al-nafs, okay? This is the health of the psyche, health of the soul. And then we can further divide, because when we say nafs, depending on who uses that term and in which discipline they use that term, it's going to have different meanings to it. So when we talk about nafs, we could be talking about, and I'm going to show you an example of this, psyche, the way that we use it today, like psychology. And the most notable individual, one of the notable individuals who uses it this way is Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, for example, and you'll see. And this is much more like a clinical psychology or psychiatry. It's more of a healthcare approach. He catalogs OCD, depression, anxiety, excessive anxiety, and then he talks about how to prevent it and how to treat it, right? Modalities of treating this nafs that has gotten sick. Or we can talk about it in the context of mental processes, more like cognitive neuroscience, okay? The faculty of mind, sort of like perception, comprehension, fantasy, memory, okay? These sorts of notions, right? And we can find individuals writing about this kind of thing, like Ibn Sina will talk a lot about this hawas al-batina, this internal faculties of thinking. Then there's, we have literature on the akhlaq literature, or virtue development, right? Development of virtue. And we have two types of genres of literature in this particular area. It's not a clinical focus, right? This is more pro-social character development that's applicable for every Muslim. Every Muslim should train their nafs, should develop themselves, should develop their character, embody positive virtues. And these are the philosophers, we'll talk about them, or the hakims, the physicians. Or the other group of individuals are the Sufis, right? Are the Sufis that we'll talk about this. The speciality of the Sufis is that they will add the sicknesses of the heart in there as well. They focus a lot more on heart processes and sicknesses of the heart as well. They catalog the sickness of the heart, amrad al-qulub, which is, or afat al-qulub, which are sort of the unique features of the Sufis. Now, if you don't believe me, right, you may say, like, where did he get this classification from? Let me just show you a little demonstration, right? And what I'd like to do is to get a true appreciation is to actually read some of this literature in Arabic, especially since this is Usul Academy. Many of our students, talabatul ilm, the students of knowledge, are coming to this institution or are interested in this institution. And many of us are learning Arabic and trying to read these works in their original language. So I'll read a little bit, and then I'll the translations on the left of the screen for you to look at, inshallah. So he says, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi says, فنقول إن الأشياء التي تنسب إلى النفس كثيرة منها قوة فاضلة كالعقل والفهم والحفظ. And he says that there are many things that can be attributed to the nafs. They are the faculties of aql, reason, such as comprehension and memory. والأخرى مسترذلة هي أضداد لها. And there are the opposites of those, or they are the sicknesses, right? And so basically they'll classify, there's, comprehension, perception, memory, and then the opposite of that would be amnesia, or brain trauma, or things like that, or an inability to perceive and comprehend. ومنها أخلاق محمودة كالعفة والسخاء والكرم. And then there's good character or praiseworthy character, such as chastity, generosity, nobility. And والأخرى مذمومة مضادة لها. And their opposites, the opposites of those which are blameworthy, that are opposite to them. ومنها أشياء عارضة تقع وترتفع سريعا كالغضب والفزع وما أشبههما. And then there are things that are sicknesses that occur, and they occur rather quickly and escalate in intensity, such as anger, and uses faza' here to refer to, as he qualifies later in his book, for severe depression and those things that resemble them. So basically, he's described this classification, which I just broke down for you, right? You can focus on character when we talk about nafs, can focus on mental processes, can focus on health and treatment of the psyche. And he says, look, وَالْمَقْصُودُ مِنَّا فِيمَا نَصِفُهُ مِمَّا يُضَافُ إِلَى الْأَنفُسِ إِنَّمَا هُوَ الشَّيْءُ الْأَخِيرُ. And he says, my scope, my focus, just so you are aware, how I'm going to use the nafs, the term nafs in my book, is in reference to the last category. That's my main objective, and that is these emotional disturbances and these psychological sicknesses that we know of today, right? The same ones that we kind of know of today: depression and anxiety and anger, impulse control, regulation, anger problems. So another important notion to keep in mind across all of these, scholars and respective fields, from the Sufis to the philosophers to the physicians, to the other scholars, right, mutakallimin and others. An important feature to keep in mind is that they all agreed upon a common epistemology. Okay, the epistemology. What is epistemology? Epistemology is how you know something. How do you come to know of some reality? When we talk about human psychology, what is the sources of evidence that we can admit in order to be able to answer this question? We have this question of what is the nature of human being? What is the source of knowledge we can admit, right? In a very pure secular kind of psychology, we have empirical knowledge, right? Maybe some rational knowledge, but they will largely reject revelation here, right? Unless they're sort of opening the door a little bit, which they are. There's some literature discussing spiritually integrated psychotherapies, but for the most part, it's largely neglected. And so this problem that has always plagued kind of the sciences and development of academia in Western Europe, as well as the US, has always been this false dichotomy between secular and sacred knowledge. Whereas in the Islamic tradition, we never had this divide between these three branches, these two branches of knowledge. In fact, whenever scholars would debate with one another or discuss an issue, they would cite and call upon these different sources of knowledge in order to prove their point. The ayah of the Quran makes this very clear. There's an ayah of the Quran that I'd like to reference. إن في خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف الليل والنهار لآيات لأولي الألباب. That verily in the changing of the night and the day, the rotation of in the creation of the heavens and the earth, the changing of the night and day are ayat, right? And one of my teachers just translate this as that for those who are objective in their knowledge, meaning for the objective mind, for the one who's not tainted with all of these isms, right? So that we have, when we look at the sciences, contextual sciences, they are ayats that indicate to the creation of Allah Ta'ala and the cosmos and the system of cause and effect. And then when we look at Quran, we also have Quran that has come to us through certain knowledge, with bitawatur, right? True reports, right? And then we also accept rational knowledge as well, like the some of the parts of a thing is greater than the whole, right? These are intuitive things that we know in knowledge, and then the laws of logic and mantiq and that sort of thing. Now, having said that, though, there are different epistemic focuses, right? Meaning each of these scholars may have a different epistemic focus, despite the fact that they may be using common sources. You will find largely the philosophers and the physicians rely mostly on empirical and rational sources of knowledge, whereas the Sufis will rely more heavily on scripture, although they definitely will not be rejecting rational and empirical sources of knowledge. And I want to kind of give you a very early definition on the health of the psyche that is written by Ibn Hazm in his Maratib al-Ilm or Maratib al-Ulum, the classification of the different sciences, of the different Islamic sciences. And he says, وَعِلْمُ الطِّبِّ, the knowledge of health can be broken down into two types. ينقسم قسمين. طِبُّ النَّفْس, it can be broken into two. طِبُّ النَّفْس, which is the health of the psyche, وهو من نتيجة علم المنطق بإصلاح الأخلاق ومداوتها وصرفها على الإفراط والتقسيم وإقامتها على الاعتدال. It is the health of the psyche, which is a byproduct of the knowledge of mantiq or reason and rational sources of knowledge. To do what? To reform the character and its treatment. Remember, we talked about character development, and to repel it from excesses and deficiencies from the two polar extremes. And hold it on, to keep it upon the path of i'tidal, which is psycho-spiritual equilibrium, to keep it on the path of equilibrium. What you will find as a common denominator across all of these scholars, between the Sufis, the philosophers, the physicians, is that they will all agree on the notion of a need for moderation, that when we're working with an individual and that we're working with their psyche, we always want to develop moderation. Not too much anger, not too little anger, for example, right? And worshiping right? In moderation, right? Not monasticism, like confining yourself to a cave and not marrying, but not the other polar extreme either, in which you just engage all of your material interests and your desires altogether. So this path of moderation, and so health in an Islamic worldview, according to these individuals, is to develop moderation, right, in one's psyche. That's what he's saying, and this is a descriptive definition that Ibn Hazm has given, which is incredible because it's a very early definition, right? I mean, we're looking at this is an Andalusian scholar, all right, Ibn Hazm, hundreds and hundreds of years, well before the advent of early psychology. Now let's come to kind of some of these big questions in psychology that we'd like to answer, that sort of continues to sort of plague modern psychologists today. First of all, what is the nature of human psychology, right? And if we look at all of these schools, they have different theories and ideas of the nature of the human psyche. So they will say, for example, the Freudians and psychodynamic folks will say that human beings are born with these aggressive and appetitive and sexual drives, and that they're born essentially evil, right? And that they just need to manage and moderate themselves in order to ensure that they don't get themselves in trouble in society, right? And then we have behaviorists who kind of believe that individuals are a blank slate. The classic statement of Watson, right? He says, give me a child and I will turn him into a criminal, or I will turn him into, a scholar, right? Basically that your environment completely influences you and there's nothing that you come in with primordially, right? You don't inherit, there's no inherent dispositions that you come in with. Biological and medical model tends to reduce individuals to a set of genetics, deterministic based upon genetics and physiology that interacts, right, with your environment, and it's genes based, right, and it's neurochemical based, right? Epigenetics and this discussion on genes sort of wire you to interact with your environment, and then the environment and the genes interact with one another to unlock these inherent dispositions within your genes. Humanistic psychologists, on the other hand, like Carl Rogers, for example, will say that human beings are born inherently good, right? And they have a capacity to self-actualize, right? And then you have emotion-focused psychotherapists like that follow a more evolutionary psychology, like Leslie Greenberg and company, who say that human beings are all born as are like animals with instincts, right? These biological survival instincts. But the human being is a more complex animal, and they're a social animal, and therefore they also have social needs like emotions and emotional instincts and social connection needs, right? So all of these folks are sort of, offering different versions and notions of human nature. Now, when we look at Islamic traditions, looking at, for example, Imam al-Ghazali, what does he say about the nature of the human being? Well, I'm just going to go with the underlying component here. He says, فَكَذَلِكَ كُلُّ مَوْلُودٍ يُولَدُ مُعْتَدِلًا صَحِيحًا عَلَى الْفِطْرَةِ. And above, he gives the analogy of the body. So when he says فَكَذَلِكَ, he's equating it like the body. He says, every child that is born in moderation and healthy upon a primordial fitra, a disposition, an inherent disposition for good, right? An inherent disposition to be able to differentiate between good and evil, an inherent disposition to be able to recognize the oneness of Allah, to connect with a creator, right? And and he's drawing this from a hadith, because there's a hadith like this, right? كل مولود يولد على الفطرة فأبواه يهودانه أو ينصرانه أو يمجسانه أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. And so Imam al-Ghazali is drawing from this hadith, and he says that everybody is born with an inherent disposition, that you are born with a good disposition inherently, and that it is your environment, their fathers, their parents, that turn them into Christians or Jews or Zoroastrians and Magians. And he's saying, بِالْإِعْتِيَادِ وَالتَّعْلِيمِ تُكْتَسَبُ الرَّذَائِلِ, that individuals are born good, however, by habituation and by being taught, they develop bad characteristics. وَكَمَا أَنَّ الْبَدَنَ فِي الْإِبْتِدَاءِ لَا يُخْلَقُ كَامِلًا, just like how the body, when it's first born, it is not created at its full development. وَإِنَّمَا يَكْمُلُ وَيَقْوَى بِالنُّشُوءِ وَالتَّرْبِيَةِ بِالْغِذَاءِ, rather it becomes stronger and develops by development through development through nourishment, right? Through nourishing it with food, nourishment through nutrients and food. فَكَذَلِكَ النَّفْسُ تُخْلَقُ نَاقِصًا قَابِلَةً لِلْكَمَالِ. Just similarly, the nafs, the human soul or the psyche, is created naqis, underdeveloped, but it has the capacity to accept and to become its full pinnacle and reach completion and perfection, full development. وإنما تكمل بالتزكية والتهذيب الأخلاقي والتغذية بالعلم, and it becomes perfected or reaches full development with tazkiyah, with refinement and purification, and a refinement of the character, and to nourish it and to feed it with knowledge. So you can see, he is saying, the example is that, look, everybody is born on the fitrah. However, one may levy an objection and say, wait a second, how come people act bad then? Well, even though they're born with an inherently good disposition, that doesn't mean they're kamil, doesn't mean they've reached full development or perfection. Rather, just like the body, for example, when a baby is born, they are born healthy. We say that they're born healthy, and that they have the inherent disposition to grow to their full milestones and to their full completion, right? But how are they going to do that? A baby is healthy as long as they don't have any sicknesses when they're born, assuming that there's no complications. They're healthy, but they're underdeveloped. So how do you need to develop them? You need to feed them, you need to nourish them, you need to develop them, right? Similarly, the human psyche works the same way. The human soul works the same way, that a person is born good, but they're not born complete. They're born naqis. And how do you bring them to full development? You have to do tazkiyah. If you don't refine them, then they will incline towards animalistic characteristics, right? Just like the child, if you don't feed it its vegetables and give it milk, what will it want to do? It will want to eat Nutella for breakfast, dinner, and lunch every day, right? Chocolate for breakfast, dinner, and lunch, and snacks and junk food. No, you have to develop it with good nourishment. Similarly, you have to develop with good character for the psyche, for psycho-spiritual development, in order for it to reach its full potential. So Ghazali is giving us a really wonderful perspective on how we have an inherent disposition, but it's very important that our environment plays a role to unlock the full potential of that disposition. Another thing that's important is that the human drives. What are the human drives, right? What motivates human beings, right? Evolutionary psychologists, they say human beings are just motivated towards survival. Freud will say human beings are motivated by appetite and sexual drives, right? Watson will say human beings are motivated by reward. If you reward them and you punish them, then they're going to be motivated by that. The Islamic, scholars, they've sort of agreed upon, there's different ways that they classify it, they add different things and have different terminologies, but for the most part, they tend to adopt these three faculties or drives, internal drives, because there's also metaphysical external drives, which I won't get into today, but the internal drives, which is appetite, shahwa, ghadab, which is survival drives or your aggressive drives, and reason, right? Appetite and survival drives, aggressive drives are not inherently evil. They motivate you for survival. If you don't have anger, for example, you can't protect yourself. You can't protect your family if you're being attacked, right? But too much anger isn't good. Too little isn't good because you can't protect yourself. Appetite is not bad. You need to be motivated in order to eat and nourish yourself. You need to sleep. You need to rest in order to give yourself energy. You need to have, sexual drives in order so that you can also be motivated to get married and to procreate, right? But too much of it is bad, right? And so what we want to do is to use the faculty of reason in order to subdue and to direct these two these drives that we have. These first two, appetite and ghadab, right? The shahwa and ghadab are shared with the animals. The animals have them. But reason is something, and aql, the faculty of aql, is something unique to the human beings, right? And Imam al-Ghazali mentions this as well, that this is a distinguishing feature of the human beings. And so we have to utilize this faculty in order to restrain and to tame and to direct these two impulses. So he says, though, however, and this is answering the question of nature versus nurture, right? Because the question is, so does nature drive an individual or does nurture drive an individual? So, because some people we find that they have a lot of anger, right? They have sort of a hot temperament. Some people are very cool and calm and relaxed. There's some people who are very neurotic and anxious. Some people are very cool and calm and relaxed. There are some individuals who have very difficult time controlling their shahwa in relation to particular things, right? Maybe somebody has a sweet tooth and they really like sweets. Another person has a interest in other things. So what drives these individuals to have these stronger drives? And he says they could be one of two possibilities: umurun ghariziyya wa umurun i'tiyadiyya. Two possibilities. One possibility is its inherent disposition, that you are just born this way. So he says, for example, فَرُبَّ إِنسَانٍ هُوَ بِالْفِطْرَةِ مُسْتَعِدٌ لِسُرْعَةِ الْغَضَبِ حَتَّى كَأَنَّ صُورَتَهُ فِي الْفِطْرَةِ صُورَةُ غَضْبَانٍ. And he says, so perhaps an individual in the upon birth, that they have been given or prepared to have get angry really quickly. They have a hot temperament. They lose the fuse really easily, to such an extent as if his face, it's as if his face at birth is the face of an angry person. Sometimes you have some of those uncles, we used to say as kids, the uncles in the masjid. You go to into the masjid, and sometimes there's some of these very mean uncles. They just have a mean face. They might not actually be angry, but you just look at them and you feel scared, right? Because they have this sort of mean disposition, right? And Ghazali says, وَيُعِينُ عَلَى ذَلِكَ حَرَارَةُ مِزَاجِ الْقَلْبِ لأن الغضب من النار كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم وإنما برودة المزاج تطفئه وتكسر ثورته. And he says that the internal dispositions, essentially the composition of the individual, their original composition, will assist them in this, right? And he says it's coming from, and he's calling upon ancient medicine in terms of hot and cold temperature and the fluid composition of the individual, and that creates sort of a heat inside, and that generates in an individual excessive amounts of anger, right? So it's very interesting. He says that, look, an individual may have a disposition towards anger. By the way, this does not mean that an individual cannot be trained, right? And we're going to get into this in a moment. That just because you're born this way doesn't mean you cannot be trained differently. And he says, Ghazali says, well, there's also another possibility as to why an individual may be really angry, have an angry disposition. وَأَمَّا الْأَسْبَابُ الْإِعْتِيَادِيَّةِ says there is habituation, habituative causes. فهو أن يخالط قوما يتبجحون بالتشفي الغيظ وطاعة الغضب. And that is that he mixes with individuals who boast or about releasing their anger and to follow the mandates of their aggressive drives. ويسمون ذلك شجاعة ورجولية فيقول الواحد منهم أنا الذي لا أصبر على المكر والمحال ولا أحتمل من أحد أمرا. And he says that these individuals say that this is, being a tough man. Bravery is to release your anger, and you'll hear one of them saying, I don't have any patience for anybody's for anything from anybody, and I will not tolerate anything from anybody, right? So that's sort of the social modeling approach, being around individuals and being influenced by them to be able to develop this excessive faculties of anger. However, Ghazali says, wait a second though, because there's an old debate, even preceding modern psychology, the modern psychological debate of nature versus nurture. There's still an old debate among the philosophers still, even during the time of Ghazali, as to whether if you are born a particular way, can you adjust that and change it? So can an angry person be kind? Can they have tolerance? Can a stingy person change their stinginess to be able to develop generosity? And he says, فَرَدُّ الْغَضَبِ وَالشَّهْوَةِ إِلَى حَدِّ الْإِعْتِدَالِ, and I'm going to jump through and read only parts of it. He says, to return anger and appetitive drives to keep it within the balance of i'tidal, to keep it balanced or to return it to the confines of balance, is mumkinun, is possible. وبالرياضة تعود إلى حد الاعتدال. And how do you do this? By exertion, spiritual exertion. تعود إلى حد الاعتدال. You can bring it back within the confines of moderation. فدل أن ذلك ممكن والتجربة والمشاهدة تدل على ذلك دلالة لا شك فيها. And he says that there is proof upon this, that it is definitely possible. And he says that experience and observation proves this. What kind of proof? A proof in which one cannot dispute. So this shows you, first of all, Ghazali didn't even cite Quran and Sunnah yet. He is only telling you from more of a reason-based, using rational and empirical bil mushahada and tajraba, right? Experience to tell you that this is definitely possible. So that's one proof that he utilizes. Then he uses Quran to corroborate this. والذي يدل على أن المطلوب هو الوسط في الأخلاق دون الطرفين أن السخاء خلق محمود شرعا. That and that which proves upon the fact that moderation in character is what's desired and not the two different extremes, is that generosity is a virtuous character, praiseworthy character according to Quran and Sunnah. And it is وهو وسط بين الطرفي التبذير والتقدير, and it is the balance between extravagance and being miserly. وقد أثنى الله تعالى عليه فقال, and Allah Ta'ala has praised this by saying والذين إذا أنفقوا لم يسرفوا ولم يقتروا وكان بين ذلك قواما. And those who, whenever they spend, they don't excessively spend, and they don't withhold too much. They're not miserly, but rather they are in the middle, moderation. So he's showing you both empirical, right, or science, observatory, right, trial and error data, and reason, and then he is also giving you Quran and Sunnah to say that it's definitely possible to train the individual. So he essentially, and also, there's a discussion of this found in the Mirqat of Mullah Ali Qari, right, who mentions with regard to a hadith, right, regarding can you actually change the nature of individuals. And he also further explains this, and he says you definitely can change the nature of individuals. However, you will never be able to extinguish their inherent dispositions entirely. So he says somebody who's miserly and born that way, they will always feel the pinch in giving lifelong. But through training and pushing themselves and developing themselves, they can bring themselves to a moderated level where they can donate and give generously, but they will always feel a sense of a pinch, and that if they don't continue to hold on to their nafs and work on it, they may regress back towards that miserliness. So they always have to be kind of watchful on themselves. One of the other questions I wanted to come to is, what is this aql, this mind? Because we talked about these two features of ghadab and shahwa, and I'll answer this question, and then I'm coming more closer to a close. So some people may say, okay, well, the faculty of cognition, and this kind of goes back to the old mind-body problem in psychology, right? This faculty of reason that we have, this faculty that guides us and directs us and allows us to reflect and to think and to direct our attention and our will, right? To make decisions and to make judgments. Where is this? Is it synonymous with the brain? And where is it located, right? Is it located physically in the body? Is it not located in the body? And this ancient mind and body problem, Descartes, for example, said this mind is located in the pineal gland physically, and that's the point where they intersect with the body, right? And then that idea was tossed out, obviously, later on. What have Islamic scholars said about this notion? And I want to use this nas here because actually I think is a very nice illustration. The notion of reason and aql, right? Is it in the heart, right? Metaphysical heart, or is it in the brain? And the question arises especially since we know brain is associated with cognitive functions, right? So is aql just synonymous with brain? Is it located in the brain? Or is it located in the metaphysical heart, right? Because what does the Quran say? أَفَلَمْ يَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَتَكُونَ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا, right? Have they not traversed the earth such that they may have hearts in which they can يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا, they can reflect with, they can reason and decipher and discern with, right? So here it seems to indicate that it's in the heart, right? The aql, the faculty of reason and discerning, is in the heart. However, we have empirical data to show that clearly thinking is also in the brain, that if you damage the brain, you cannot have the faculty of cognition and reflection anymore. So which is it? And so I want to show this as an illustration of the sophistication of our Islamic scholars in how they're able to reconcile empirical and sacred information. Empirical and sacred information. So they say this is found in the Hashiyah of Imam al-Bajuri, where he gives a commentary on a kalam work of an Ash'ari work written by Imam al-Laqani. And he says, that there's a dispute as to where it is, where its location is, this aql, right? This faculty of discernment. وَالصَّحِيحُ أَنَّهُ محله القلب وله نور متصل بالدماغ كما ذهب إليه إمام الشافعي والإمام المالك وجمهور المتكلمين, right? And he says that a position, right, that's given is that it's the correct position is that its location is in the heart. Which heart? we're referring to the metaphysical heart here. وَلَهُ نُورٌ, but it has a nur, a light that is connected with the brain. This is the position of Imam Shafi and Imam Malik, and the dominant position of the scholastic theologians, the mutakallimin. But then he says, wait, there are other positions as well. وقالت الحكماء وبعض الفقهاء بأن محله الدماغ لفساده بفساد الدماغ. And he says that some of the physicians or philosophers and physicians, physicians rather, and the fuqaha and the jurists have said that its place is in the brain because, and this is the reason they're using empirical information, since when it becomes corrupted or dysfunctional, right? It becomes dysfunctional whenever the brain becomes dysfunctional. Meaning you lose the faculty of reasoning and discernment if the brain becomes dysfunctional, right? And so for them, it's easy. They say, hey, look, empirical information says this, and so we will interpret and understand the Quranic ayah a different way. But Imam al-Bajuri mentioned something very nice here, and he defends the position of the dominant position. And he says, وَهَذَا لَا يَدُلُّ عَلَى مَا ذَكَرُوهُ. He says, this does not prove this point, that it's in the brain, that which they mentioned. Why? Because لِجَوَازِ أَن تَكُونَ سَلَامَةَ الدِّمَاغِ شَرْطًا لِإِسْتِمْرَارِهِ وَإِنْ كَانَ مَحَلُّهُ الْقَلْبِ. And he says, because it is possible that the properly functioning, sound functioning of the brain is a prerequisite and a condition in order for the aql, in order for this mind, in order for this faculty of discernment to exercise itself, to manifest its faculties, even though its location may be in the metaphysical heart. So it's amazing. He's saying, look, there's this light that emanates, that goes to the brain, and then it informs the brain. So it's not the brain. So for example, if you have a GPS and you're walking somewhere or you're driving somewhere, you are not, right, on that screen and on the GPS. The GPS is simply just a map showing what's happening in reality, right? Where you are in reality. Similarly, the brain is firing all these neurons and electrodes and whatnot, and it's a reflection of what's happening in the metaphysical heart, i.e., the aql being the part of the metaphysical heart. So you can see this beautiful reconciliation to say, look, what you can see here is what's amazing is that they're not rejecting empiricism, they're not rejecting science, they're not rejecting Quran and Sunnah, they're bringing them together to have this sophisticated discussion. And one last question that I want to address with regard to this notion of mind in with regard to modern psychology is this notion of mental processes versus mental acts. Let me just jump to that one, actually. So how do we define a mental act versus a mental process? Okay. Why is this important? Because, for example, in CBT, right, cognitive behavioral therapy, in mainstream psychology, they'll say, all of your thoughts, like where do your thoughts come from? All of your thoughts, they are coming from some underlying beliefs. And if you have bad beliefs, and then you'll have bad thoughts, and then you will think bad, and then you will psychologically become sick. ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, they say, no. Thoughts are not indicators of belief. You are not your thoughts. They come from various different places, but you are not your thoughts. And therefore they say, you don't need to worry too much about your thoughts. You just let them pass through because they can be coming from different sources. right? Maybe memories, maybe, things that your parents said in life. They're just essentially these mental processes that occur in your mind, and they don't have anything to do with your beliefs. So then the patients are told by CBT, pay attention to your thoughts and change them and control them, and you have control over them. ACT says, don't worry about their thoughts. You're not your thoughts. You don't control them. Just let them pass through your mind. The question is, which is it, right? And it goes back to answering the question of what is a mental act, right? What is a mental act versus a mental process? And so this is where I want to shed some light on this using kind of an Islamic classification, an Islamic multiplex classification, right? So I've just kind of compiled this based upon the literature found in the Islamic traditions. So scholars will kind of look at mental processes. We can look at a'mal, acts that are not seen, that are mental acts, right? And then there are mental processes. They're both not seen, but mental acts are really important. Why? Because you are responsible for mental acts. Okay, give you an example. So acts of the heart, mental acts of the heart, you are responsible for. So your beliefs, you're responsible for your beliefs, right? So when you have a thought, you may be thinking something that's related to your beliefs. You're thinking about the Prophet ﷺ, you're thinking about the Sahaba, you're thinking about your life as a Muslim, right? These are your i'tiqadat, your beliefs, right? They may first come to you as a thought. Somebody talks to you about them, then you believe it, then you act upon it, and then you have iman, right? Amantu, right? Amantu billah, I believe in Allah, right? Then there's acts that we do intentionally with the heart as well, which we call acts. Tafakkur, sitting and doing reflection, directing the heart towards something. We have intentions. Innamal a'malu binniyat. Actions are by their intentions. So even if I intend a good deed, but I'm not able to do it, inshallah, I'll get the reward for it. And then there's resolutions. Before a niyyah, there's a resolution. I say, I will most certainly do this, and I will make a commitment to doing this action. And that is a resolution. This is an act of the heart, and you're responsible, and it's fully within your control. But then we also have mental processes. We have mental processes like what? Mental processes of both the brain and the heart, right? These ones we're not responsible for, right? For example, fantasies and thoughts that may come into your mind, memories that come into your mind, thinking or inner conversation, inner talk that you have, right? And then we have the heart processes, which may be often, as Ghazali says, actually the doubled satanic whispers, it should be satanic versus angelic whispers. There's waswasa and there's ilham. You have these metaphysical influences on your heart, right? You're not responsible for these. Like you get inspired to do a good deed. The angel tells you to do something, inspiration. That's not in and of itself an act yet. If you act upon it, you turn it into an act. But shaitan gives you a whisper. He says, do this, don't pray, don't wake up for Fajr. If you turn it into an act, or if you turn it into a commitment, then, or if shaitan tells you a belief that is wrong, that's just the thought that passes through your mind, right? So this is kind of a resolution to give you a little bit more of a comprehensive perspective. And we actually use some of these processes in our psychotherapy in order to make sure that we can appropriately differentiate. And I'll give you a quick example. It's like the example of OCD, for example, right? In OCD treatment, what do? We will make sure that we distinguish between those thoughts that they can't control and that they're not responsible for, between their beliefs. Because somebody who has OCD, waswasa, right? They might think, I thought a negative thought, therefore I became a disbeliever. But that's not true, because it might be a waswasa of shaitan. You're not responsible for that. It's not a mental act. A mental act would be a commitment to that belief. And so giving this distinction is important, because when they go to other psychologists, they tell them, all of your thoughts are related to your beliefs, change your beliefs. And they say, oh no, that means I thought a thought of kufr, that means I must be a non-Muslim. Or if they go to another psychologist, they say, all of your thoughts are just these things that come through your mind. They're not related to your beliefs. He's like, well, how do I know which one of my thoughts are beliefs, which ones are not? Because I know I'm a Muslim, I believe in this. Is that just kind of a thought that's not a real belief either? So it kind of confuses individuals. The last slide I'm sort of just touching upon, and this is my concluding slide, is to say this is kind of the process of what we're trying to undergo in an Islamic psychology production process. What we want to do is to review the corpus, literature review of the scholarly tradition, right? Islamic scholarly tradition. And today you just got a little bit of flavors by some sprinkling of different pieces of information. Then what we want to do is do a literature review of contemporary psychology. We want to critically analyze and synthesize some of this information using an Islamic framework. And then what we produce is comparative education or integrated knowledge production. So that's the goal of what we'd like to do. Inshallah, this is what we can do. At one of the things that I believe we've endeavored to do at Usul Academy is to survey the Islamic intellectual heritage, teach the Islamic heritage, teach contemporary social sciences, filter and synthesize and create kind of solutions to address contemporary problems. And that's the conclusion of my talk for today. I guess maybe we can open the floor to any questions, thoughts, reflections. Inshallah, wa akhiru da'wan and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hooman, for a wonderful lecture, mashallah, through the force indeed. For all those who want to ask questions, either raise your hand, your virtual hand, inshallah, and we'll take you in turn, or post your question in the chat box. But we would prefer if you can raise your hand and verbally articulate your question, inshallah. Adil, tafadhal.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Walaikum assalam.
Yeah, I'm very thankful to Dr. Hooman, such a wonderful presentation. I have a question regarding abnormal behavior. When we talk about the abnormality of a person, the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, it classifies that when this is the criteria for abnormal behavior. Does the jurist, does fuqaha have any criteria for defining abnormality?
Yes, that's a very, very, very good question. So first of all, you have to kind of look at first. We have to
Everyone,
make
keep the microphone muted, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So there's a really important distinction to be made, because when you're saying jurists, I just want to make a important clarification that when you say jurists, we're talking about law and the classification of insanity, legal insanity, according to jurists, as well as modern legal insanity, is different than clinical pathology. Okay. There is some overlap, which is what we call forensic psychology, or the intersection between mental status and law, but there's also things that don't overlap. And I'll give you a very clear example of that. So for example, in order to be responsible for your prayers, right, you need to have the presence of mind, aql, as a shart, as a condition, right? And so if you don't have the presence of aql, then you're not responsible for your prayers, okay? And therefore, you will be exempted from having to pray your prayers. This would be somebody, for example, who may be psychotic, right? Actively psychotic, or somebody who has severe intellectual disability, mental retardation, right? They may want to pray and they enjoy praying and they join people, but they're not responsible for prayer. That would be the type of things that fuqaha would be interested in. The area where, so their large concern and question for a jurist is whether you're liable and responsible for something or not. That's a very different question than the physicians have, right? Because so take, for example, depression. An individual may say, I'm depressed, right? Do I still have to pray? Now, if you're mildly depressed, but you're diagnosed as clinically depressed, you're still sick, but you will you're still responsible for prayer. Do you see what I'm saying? There may be a place like fasting, for example, right, where an individual has a more severe depression and they need medication, right, for example, and they, for some reason or another, and I'm not saying that this happens often, because oftentimes you can tailor the different dosages for different times around fasting, but let's just envision a scenario where they needed their medications in order to manage themselves, then they may be exempt from fasting, for example, but that would be marad. And so there are different, so the fuqaha are really concerned with, responsibility and liability. But when we come outside of the scope of the jurists, and then we come into healthcare disciplines, right? And if we include psychospiritual health, right, then Imam al-Ghazali, for example, will talk about functioning of limbs, right? So he does classify functioning, which is similar to what DSM will talk about today, right? In terms of functionality, right? And so he says all limbs have an original purpose and function. If we had time, we'd actually read that matan, the section in which he talks about. And he says the eyes are designed for seeing, and the qalb is designed to reflect and do tafakkur and have knowledge and to know Allah. And if you don't have the capacity to do that, then it is dysfunctional and it will need treatment, right? And how and what kind of treatment you will need will depend on the type of dysfunctioning you will have, okay? So if you have dysfunction, for example, that requires professional clinical treatment, like panic attacks and panic disorders, right? Then you will go to a professional psychologist, mental health practitioner for that. But if it's predominantly spiritual in nature, right? Functioning that stops you from being able to connect with Allah and learn knowledge and whatnot, then you will need to go to spiritual practitioners. And there's actually a huge discussion amongst the fuqaha about whether healthcare, right, healthcare treatment is mandatory or not. This is called wujub at-tadawi, okay? Wujub at-tadawi, right? The mandation of whether you're required to seek healthcare treatment or not. And there's a discussion on this. And so one of the features is that, look, if you are going to be dysfunctional and you cannot assist others or fulfill your obligations, right? Then the fuqaha, at least one of the positions of the Hanafiya, is that if the treatment is proven to be effective, it's actually wajib for you to seek treatment, right? And there's different positions among the fuqaha. Certainly there are others that will say, the Shafi'is will say it's mustahab, right? But it's not wajib, right? So there's this discussion. So I don't know if that kind of makes it clear. The fuqaha are talking about functioning, whereas clinicians are really, and atibba are looking more at, sorry, not functioning. They're looking at functioning. The fuqaha are looking at responsibility.
Yeah. Thanks. Just please, could you suggest to me some further readings, so that I can go deep into it? Actually, I just wanted to work in abnormal behaviors and how to change these behaviors within Islamic psychology perspective. I wanted to work with with this theme, just please recommend me some readings so that I can go further into it.
Sure. I mean, we have several articles and books and whatnot that you can look at. If you email me, then inshallah I can respond with the suggestions for chapters and books and sections in particular that deal with this question, inshallah.
Dr. Hooman, there's a question that was posted, written down. I'm going to read it out for you.
Sure.
You mentioned that there are some bad aspects of personality that cannot be eliminated completely, as explained by Imam al-Ghazali. How would you understand then, doesn't this first mean that all humans are completely innately good?
Yeah, so I kind of explained that in the sense of that everybody is born with the disposition of the fitrah, but that means that they have the faculty, right, to be able to know Allah, to be able to and there's different discussions among the Asharis and Maturidis on the notion of fitrah. I'm relying upon a Maturidi classification, given that I'm a Maturidi myself. So the Maturidis believe that individuals can distinguish between universal good and bad, that the fitrah essentially allows individuals to recognize the trueness of Allah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have any dispositions that takes them away from that fitrah. Depending on the disposition that an individual has will determine the type of training that is required in order to be able to act upon that fitrah, right? For example, the Quran says, وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا, right? By the nafs, the way he has fashioned it, it has a capacity for good and it has a capacity for evil. So the nafs has this inherent, every human being has different dispositions, right? And we don't call these evil dispositions, but we call them dominant dispositions, okay? So for example, an individual who is, who is very, they need to make sure that they bring all of these faculties that they have in accordance with the mandates of Sharia. That's what fitrah gives you. Fitrah gives you the capacity to know good and bad. Fitrah gives you the capacity to be able to govern, right? Fitrah gives you the capacity to be able to say, look, just like Ghazali said, you are not built as a kamil, right? You're not built perfect. You're built naqis. That's the example he gave. He said, look, you have everybody, everybody's born on the fitrah, but you are born naqis, not kamil. And إنما تكمل بالتزكية والتهذيب الأخلاقي والتغذية بالعلم, right? That an individual can only become perfected, right, through these faculties of doing tazkiyah and character development and through knowledge, right?
Thank you, Dr. Hooman, for that. Zuli?
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Hooman. A question I had is related to the Islamic multiplex of thoughts that you discussed towards the end. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on the limit, if any, of the capacity of Muslim or Islamic psychologists to address the various levels of thoughts, so including both mind and heart processes. So for example, I guess, are psychologists only able to address mind processes, and so should rather refer patients or clients to different avenues like tasawwuf, or is there, is it all dependent really on Islamic psychology, like the person's training themselves? Yeah.
This is actually a quite complex kind of question, because or complex answer to the question, because you really we would need a lot more time to really unpackage this. There's a lot more overlap. I didn't get an opportunity to talk about kind of the notion of sort of the makeup of the human psyche, like parts of what is aql, what is nafs, what these internal drives, what is qalb, is it different than aql, these sorts of things. This becomes really important to be able to answer these questions. And then what is body and what is considered body and what is considered the sort of metaphysical part. But if I was to answer in a very simple way, I would say that, look, mental health disorders can be broken down into two portions. One which is much more of a body process, brain process, and depression, like things like depression, the same disorder can have different sources of the problem. So for example, you have depression that can be highly genetic, highly heritable, right? Highly biological and very resistant to treatment. Then you can have depression that is very environmentally induced, like pessimistic thinking, being in bad environments, having some tragedies occur to the individual, and then they do become depressed. I think there's a difference between those two kinds of depressions. The first one is really a biological, more of a neurochemical process that does need psychotherapy, but you also need psychiatry for that, medication management. The second one, which is much more of a environmentally induced, is the one that we actually refer to as psychological in origin. We say it's a psychological problem. It's more psychologically based. In mental health, we often say this. This is not really bio-based, it's more psychologically based. The question is, what does that mean, right? Wait, it's not in the body, it's not biologically, so what the heck is it then? It's psychologically based, right? It goes back to thinking. And I believe that we are ultimately working on, when we say the psyche, and we're working on those type of problems, even as a psychologist, you're working on the metaphysical faculties of the individual. You are working on the metaphysical essence of the individual. This is a metaphysical process, this sort of notion of qalb and aql and whatnot, and nafs. But the distinction between scopes of practice doesn't have to do with the person as much as it has to do with the professionals, like what you're trying to do with that person. If we're working with functioning issues, right? Like I'm working with marital problems, I'm working with depression, I'm working with anxiety, I'm working with social anxiety. This is my job, right? And I may even use Quran and Sunnah and Dhikr to aid them in reducing the anxiety so they can be functional, right? But if I'm working on spiritual development purely, like somebody's coming to me, let's say coming to a psychologist, and they want spiritual development. I want to be a better person. I want to, develop really good character. I want to have more khushu and salah. I want to be able to worship Allah better. I want to be able to live more consciously as a Muslim. And they want to work on character development and removal of sicknesses of the heart and character sicknesses of the heart. Then that is the scope of theology. That is the scope of tasawwuf and the Sufis, and they will go there, right? So we're not suggesting just because you're working on the same, human being, right? That we don't need to oversimplify the metaphysical element of the individual, that we have different aspects of ourselves with different needs and different parts of ourselves. And so we, split up the scope in that way. Does that sort of make sense?
Yes, just go ahead.
Habiba?
Yes, assalamu alaikum, Dr. Hooman, jazakumullah khairan. In following up on this question, I just try to understand for myself from the lens of, because you brought the example of the depression. Let's assume it's an endogenetic, like depression, like medical psychiatry, but like coming from the Islamic lens in terms of hikmah and trial and tribulation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, would that not make sense to still include the ghaibi and the metaphysical realm in terms of it will affect at the end the heart of the patient? I mean the heart, not like the physical heart, but like the the spiritual heart. For example, a question like why me, and why did it happen to me? Even like in the medical field, like let's assume it's just not just, but it's cancer, and not something that affects the psyche primarily. I mean, secondarily, it will affect the psyche, and people would maybe even leave their faith because of this trial. So for me, it would make sense to take it from a holistic point of view, and definitely include that in terms of therapy. Wallahu alam. So that would be my question. Like, why do we distinguish it from the very beginning? This is psychological, and the psychiatrist deals with it, where in terms of Islamic psychology, the Islamic psychologist would definitely even deal with it and have the aid of the psychiatrist in terms of medication. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you basically answered your own question. It's I agree with your answer. It's it's not this or that. They're both. The importance of making a classification or distinction is is because of the fact that you need to distinguish in order to know where you're going to predominantly focus your intervention. So what is your predominant intervention? What is your auxiliary or supportive intervention? So for example, if an individual says, let's take the depression example. Somebody says they have a chronic depression, they're not responding to psychotherapy, and they go to like shuyukh, and they go to, therapists, and they're really struggling. And then nobody ever says to them, hey, it might be a good idea for you to really try some SSRIs. Let's try some anti-depression medication. Or let's say it's a bipolar even, right? And they're bipolar manic, and then they just feel guilty. Oh my God, I'm doing like this risky behavior. I'm doing things that are not acceptable. Well, that's bad practice, right? We need to tell them, we need to say, look, this requires medical intervention, it requires psychiatric treatment, and we're going to work alongside of you supportively, right, to do the psychotherapy as well. Obviously, they both go hand in hand, and spirituality is not exited from the conversation. Rather, it's very, very important that it's a part of that conversation. We're going to, do things like, come into terms with that reality. Maybe that's going to be a trial. There's kafaratul dhunub, right? Shedding of sins. There's elevation of status, raf'u darajat in here, that we kind of help them with, and we talk about coping mechanisms and whatnot. So absolutely. Does that seem to fit? I didn't sort of intend them to be that they're like absolutely distinguished from one another. And even this classification, mostly in the body, biological, mostly psychological, there's a lot of kind of gray area and spectrum in between here. So this is just kind of a more oversimplification, but just for the purposes of sort of being able to position them in our minds is why I've listed it that way or framed it that way.
Thank you for that response, Dr. Keshavarzi. I think we might leave it at that. Inshallah, before I hand it over to you, Dr. Keshavarzi, for a few closing words and maybe a dua. For all of you out there, please follow us on our website. I shared the website in the chat group, on Instagram, on Facebook, on YouTube. We will be posting all our events there, inshallah. And we will be organizing one of these wonderful public lectures every term, inshallah. Barakallahu feekum. Dr. Keshavarzi?
I don't have any closing words aside from Jazakumullah khair to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to, join us from all these different time zones on this wonderful platform to spend this much time out of your schedule to learn, inshallah, about a subject that maybe you're in this field, maybe you're not, but you spent the time to really, show interest in what our tradition has to say about human psychology. I pray that Allah Ta'ala put barakah in your pursuits and your knowledge and your practices, and make this what we've learned today a wasila of khair, a means of being able to serve Allah and turn this ilm into amal. I would defer to Dr. Rajab, my teacher, for the dua here, and I would love to just raise my hands as he does and say Ameen to his duas.
I think so.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hooman Hoja. Jazakallah khairan. May Allah give you best success in your efforts to rebuild, revive, renew Islamic psychology on its traditional roots and combining it with the insights of the modern psychology. Jazakallah khairan. May Allah give you at-tawfiq al-kamil in your efforts to learn as well as research and teach. Happy and grateful and honored, with this first Usul lecture by you, and inshallah this was a great opening, and your approach really reflects the Usul academic approach, rooted revival. You presented excellent revive traditional knowledge by combining it with modern knowledge. Jazakallah khairan, wafakakallah, and Allah keep everyone here in this majlis in good health, and may Allah guide us, guide others. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you everyone for attending. Assalamu alaikum.